I was recently watching a debate between Milo Yiannopoulos and Destiny. I think it was dated around August 2020, so fairly recently. I must say, I was disgusted at the general content of the debate. Milo, I think, did not adequately incisively criticize the disagreements that he did air, but he didn't vindicate those disagreements well enough. Yeah. It's interesting. While I was watching this video, there was a button at the bottom of YouTube that had this kind of clipping function. I don't know what the point of that was, but anyway, I mean, everything that I'm talking about pretty much happens in the last 15% of the video, maybe the last 20% of the video. Um, that's where when they're taking audience questions, especially, there's sort of a similar kind of cerebral histrionic that asks a question, which is all about the kind of the systemic racism kind of stuff. So Milo complained earlier on. This is what the question centered around. Milo complained earlier on that sort of already when leftists sort of set up the racial systemic paradigm, that essentially the framework has already been rigged with premises which essentially are conveniently fudged and convenient moral generalizations. And it's sort of when they are re-exploring this topic, and Milo is called out for essentially fobbing off the claim instead of making an incisive critique of it, which in some sense, I think that how Milo commented in that way is perfectly fine, but how it was relitigated was quite. Milo performed quite poorly, I would say, but and Destiny said all these things in defense of his general position. And there is a lot of ideological gainsaying and dishonesty laden in what Destiny said, and Milo sort of left it on the table. I mean, I understand these things are sort of going very fast, but anyway, Milo touches on the same theme when he's talking about some other things, and he's slightly depressed when he says, well, if we have lost the argument for higher principles, maybe it's conservatives who should be getting in on trying to design these speech codes and things like that, that we should, in the name of Christianity, we should say that, no one is allowed to question the kind of the claim of some Christian dogma, so that we get a sort of a slice of the action or something like that, so that we're at the bargaining table, and that the Christian right needs to kind of plug into the program. I mean, in some sense, I think Milo is making a serious point, perhaps even I don't know necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying that he's not being he's being serious, but he's also not being serious as well, to make a point. But the point is also that well, that should be potentially a serious point to be raised when you're dealing with the kind of intellectual poverty that has taken over so much cultural territory, and so many people go along with it. Now, I would be more precise at criticizing Destiny for being part of this disgusting mob, as being one of the sort of the intellectual apologists of this kind of disgusting moral reductionism and moral obtuseness. which is essentially what the whole structure and paradigm and intellectual framework of systemic oppression is all about. Is essentially it's saying we could make a better world because we could control society better, and therefore we would be more effective at sort of rehabilitating or being remedial in fixing up things if we would just all adopt this kind of moral obtuseness and say that people are in the position that they are because of history and statistics. And therefore, the way to solve their problems is to treat them as a group, as a generalization, and to involve ourselves in the moral, in the unprincipled, sort of that is how that we need we need czars, we need commissions, we need governmental um, intermediaries and mediators over how society functions in order to intervene and to filter out the historical defect. The problem is that when you're morally obtusely filtering out some kind of historical consequence and trying to control an outcome, the process itself actually needs to have some kind of moral backing within it, not just the means are justified by the ends, which is effectively, and Milo thematically made this point when he says, if we as conservatives or people who are classically liberal have lost the argument for higher principles, maybe we should just get in on trying to get a piece of the control structure. Anyway, semi-serious point that's making a serious thematic point. And so, the idea that you're going to sort of train a whole generation to be complicit or to be an ally or to be morally okay, I can't think of the word, but to sanitize this kind of moral obtuseness and lack of principle because because the generalization is the instrument of bringing about like a higher kind of social justice, which is literally defined as a kind of parasitic redistribution of group pride, which is sentimentally so very sort of toxic and anti-morality to a large extent. Sort of supplementing. It's designed to sort of be an unsustainable, sort of monstrosity. To move into a morally obtuse position where you're only looking at situations from the point of view of groups, that you give yourself the excuse that we're allowed to interpret the situation as if groups had moral standing and were the source of moral consideration instead of individuals. When you already allow for that kind of fundamental depersonalization of people, you've tapped into a very dark engine of cerebral histrionics, I would call it, because I mean, Destiny, I just find such a fundamentally intellectually sort of disgusting kind of operator. You could see it very much in this debate with Milo, over and over again. He would literally explicitly disagree with Milo to then make a point which was fundamentally obtuse and fundamentally, let's say, agnostic to the thing that he explicitly supposedly contradicted in what Milo was saying. So, it's sort of, you say you disagree, then you fundamentally reframe the whole issue, and then you, even within what you say, you have repeated the same point that you explicitly disagreed with. It's a sophistry. It's a kind of rhetorical way of sort of sadistically I mean, you can see the kind of how it's got layers of almost sort of like psychological penetration and reframing that, oh, I know what you mean, what you say, and I'm saying that what you mean is wrong, even though, like, and then I'm going to give my own treatment, which is just basically completely reframing the whole thing into a different cut up, even though I've just partially agreed with you at the minimum. Whereas actually, I've just reframed what you have said by setting it up, by describing it differently, by using different adjectives and almost disguising the principled conflagration by essentially just creating an ulterior narrative. So it's just constantly gainsaying with sort of ulterior narratives. I mean, I don't know how people put up with that. Um, it's for me, that's a kind of narrative witchcraft. I mean, that's a level of sort of decompartmentalization if I've ever seen one. That's sort of like, Destiny. I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I call him a cerebral histrionic, but it almost seems like his whole psychology has been informed by being a sort of a flying monkey for a borderline, that he is just so primed in terms of enabling some kind of cultural borderline entity. I mean, this is how pseudo intellectuals have kind of always um, couched their rationalization, that it's got a kind of a cultural or subculture, sort of um, partisan uh, um, position, which then, um, has this general sadistically edged program, and then you have, people who are capable of effectively. Sorry, this is going to. I'm bringing in too many elements now, but I argued, or I made the case in one of my earlier recordings, that essentially to me it's very interesting how generally how I would describe identity politics as having a um, semantic claims about what words really mean in their jargon, in their lexicon, in their philosophical framework, and which allows them essentially to ignore when people say things, because they can just be like, oh, that's not what that word really means. So they don't even have to inquire after what the counterpoint really was, because they don't have to animate what they said in any kind of good faith. They've got every excuse to say, oh, that word actually means something else. So they just sort of get out of it. Um, and then the second part is that they have a sociological plan, which is the amelioration of all these problems, and that sociological plan has so much tentative control that it offers to people that it's too useful not to give up. And so both of these claims, uh, they've got a sociological planning claim and they've got a semantic claim, allow them to insulate themselves against anyone who says anything against any position that they say. And these things have a circular reasoning that they can also perpetrate between these two separate claims. So that you can kind of develop infinite regresses between these two types of invidious and pernicious, ways of insulating yourself from hearing anything or having to seriously contend with anything that disagrees with you. So, these are the two sort of arms of a kind of um, solipsism, a kind of moral solipsism to entrench what is already a morally obtuse position. Very, very dangerous. Anyway, I've tried to argue that in some ways, although systems that try to do this holistically are not without, man, this is a completely separate point, but can in can include things that are interesting to study, can include topics that are useful to look at, but they have to be very holistic. And so what I'm about to say is a bit of a pinch of salt, um, but thematically it's important that identity politics is very close to some versions of Islam. They have a semantic sort of a paradigm in which things mean things that are all comport into being components of a functioning way in which meaning itself makes sense in terms of an installed in some sense, words and meaning itself gives a basic definitional matrix which amounts to the total authority and correctness of their point of view. And then you have the sociological planning. Um, anyway, why did I bring up that parallel? And anyway, and identity politics I've also just described is basically a kind of another iteration of fascism, essentially. So you have all of these things, and usually, fascism and or any kind of identity politics is, I think, much more likely to be, I mean, in some sense, all of these things are centered around a um, a conveniently parasitic categorical sense of self, in terms of that the identity itself is basically like a borderline entity. It has a borderline capacity to reframe reality in a kind of relativism that is convenient to it being able to shirk blame off onto scapegoats, it being able to usually it can only do this by saying that, well, it just wants it's been a victim of circumstances or external pressures that don't conform to its pure and, let's say, innocent but also righteous intentionality and positive motivation. So it's sort of, it is the unilateral sort of cupbearer of all the good things. It has all the good adjectives pertaining to it anyway. And so there is this kind of there is this basic assumption and this basic claim, which is again reflected in the semantic claim, but also in the sociological planning claim, that you just need to sort of get on board. Um, and the problem with that is that hypothetically, even, it's potentially workable from just from a pure ideas perspective, because you don't actually have to know how to deal with a problem honestly and justly and directly if you can just substitute dealing with that problem with the issue of control. Because in the long term, if you can control that issue, then it doesn't matter how well or how unwell you were able to solve the problem, because you're solving the problem of control instead. So you can base the problem with this whole general thing is that, justice becomes essentially, well, whoever, I mean, the Führer principle itself has this built into it, that, well, if you didn't actually succeed at bringing justice to the identity or bestowing um, the correct amount of prestige on your identity, then you weren't actually the Führer. You know, at least from the proto-fascistic sort of philosophical premises. Um, anyway, at some point, those philosophical premises actually contradict by there being a complete commitment to a particular sociological manifestation of how the plan will be deployed. And so, Hitler actually became the Fuhrer. Um, he wasn't a candidate Fuhrer, he was the Fuhrer. And in some sense, what happened there is that if he were to not succeed, it wouldn't be him that would be at fault. It would be the people that didn't live up to his vision or something like that. So you really do sort of sell your soul into a kind of collective representation where the kind of the moral reductionism actually anyway, this is too much of a tangent that it's not relevant, but this is the end game of the kind of the moral nebulousness and reductionism and vacuousness of the current uh, things that are being toyed with by people like Destiny. But anyway, so where I see Milo having failed in standing up for this is essentially you have to make a moral critique about the systemic stuff, about framing issues. The excuses that Destiny produces at this questionnaire at the end are very telling. He says, "Oh, well, the reason why we have to have a systemic sort of perspective is because that's the level at which policy interacts with society. So, that is the sort of, to a person with a hammer, everything is a nail. And so, we should have to think about this from the perspective of the government." I mean, in some sense, I mean, that doesn't, I don't think that's rational at all. I mean, in some sense, that means that the kind of um, assistance, I mean, first of all, it sort of it obtusely treats the problem. Again, like it's weird how pragmatic. So if you say, well, people are poor because of the consequences of evil things that were done to them based on their group association and based on history, that doesn't mean that the solution is the opposite, is the inverse of the thing that caused the problem. Like that does not make any sense whatsoever. That the solution would have to be targeted in the same way that the damage was supposedly calculated and targeted. The idea that the system inherits this kind of moral um, debt to be divvied out, in and again, like the biggest problem with this is that you're creating a false moral narrative because and a simplistic and obtuse way that's morally obtuse, but also it's pragmatically obtuse because it sort of tries to translate the issue into an issue of social psychology that can be fixed if you have some kind of direct intervention in the statistics. That if you can just sort of mandate that the statistics be more even, that you can kind of fix things. And this is probably the most sort of evil thing about identity sort of combating of structural um, oppression that centers around bestowing things on different identities. Um, okay, so I'm just I wrote a thing about this. So because if you try to manhandle the statistics directly, all you end up doing is entrenching resentment and disempowerment by the fixation on imposing different standards rather than setting up different measures of support and on the supply side. you know you never create the proper supply side measures when you are just basically controlling for outcomes. So the blanket impositions of sort of token endorsements and the kind of institutional dishonesty to cover up for the mandated imposters that are the coveted ideological tokens that sort of play into the morality play of the reductionism of looking at the situation from the point of view of the group. So you have principles being thrown away in favor of a kind of naked group chauvinism that can only sanitize itself by promoting overt sentiments of group essentialism. So, and you can see Destiny doing this directly, where he's like, the reason why these people have whatever bad conditions they might have is because of a kind of group essentialism which was imposed on them by the structure of the system, and that they have somehow inherited this essentialism, and it's not going to go away until we have some kind of inversion of the same thing, which is, because in some sense, I mean, I believe that in some sense structural oppression is certainly, something. I mean, I think that morally to kind of fixate on it is morally obtuse, because you have to throw away your principles to put on that perspective. But I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong about thinking about things, but you see where it runs aground so quickly. So let's just think about structural oppression. So if you can say, okay, well, structural oppression is a real statistical force that is felt by a group. I don't know how groups feel things, but anyway, somehow in the generalization, the group can feel something. Obviously, that can only be reflected in some kind of group culture. That's the only thing that's going to have a reflection in. So there is obviously social psychology around group cultures, but the idea that that is the project of target of trying to fix that feeling, how the hell does that get you anywhere towards actually changing conditions on the ground? And although systemic, levers like using law and regulation can certainly damage groups by being targeted, explicitly targeting those groups, um, so it can inflict systemic oppression. What's to say that the inverse is true, that it's possible of creating a systemic benefit? Because in some sense, the so-called benefit that is supposedly being ever delivered to people is, I would argue, in some sense, it's only relatively beneficial in the way that it prejudices another group. So it can only be beneficial to the extent to which that it's kind of parasitic, or to the extent to which it's being vampiristic over some other group, that sort of relativistically it promotes one group by degrading another group, or degrading the interests, or prejudicing the interests of another group. So now I would argue that although that is capable of hurting a group, it's not necessarily capable of advancing a group. I think that there are two. I'm making a claim about the nature of systemic oppression itself. We know that systemic oppression can, let's say, in some generalization, hurt people, but I think that it has never been proven, and it cannot be shown, that it helps other people. That the systemic oppression targeted at one group automatically gives a benefit to another group that isn't so hurt. The idea that it actually facilitates a kind of a redistribution, or exploitation. Yeah, the idea that exploitation and systemic oppression sort of are, that is that is an equivocation that needs to be uh, um, investigated seriously, rather than just emotionally conflated. And so the idea that you're going to sort of run systemic oppression in reverse, so that you're going to even things out, essentially that evening out is not by providing benefits to people, it's not by transforming and empowering them, it's just by disempowering other people. That supposedly it's their time to be disempowered, so that we can all go down to the same level. And again, this doesn't do anything to actually build and transform and actually rehabilitate or fix any condition on the ground whatsoever. Because what do people need? Well, if people can't get by because of, and it's described, because of the historical consequences of racial systemic oppression that we are still sitting with in the present today, well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is a quality education. So how is getting a quality education got anything to do with double standards, with imposing mandates, with enforcing outcomes? You know, so all the identity politics stuff doesn't even want you to have education. It wants to get into the cultural group psychology, the social psychology aspect of the kind uh, of the sadistically, it's basically it's a very nasty way of pretending to relitigate history, because you can't relitigate history. You can't change history. It's already happened. I mean, the project that it's worth sort of that you're directly healing history through what you're doing in the present is a kind of obtuse moral reductionism, which again is, like, I mean, in some general sense, to like a very young person, you might you might make a narrative like that, but that kind of moral narrative is fundamentally unprincipled. It's fundamentally to treat people as parts of a group and expect that the group has the basic source of moral consideration. It's fundamentally toxic. It's evil. It's the main sort of moral obtuseness, which is the engine of all, sort of conflicts that never. It creates in fact, it requires a fundamental Cold War in order to sustain itself. Yeah, I mean, I I can see Destiny when he talks about these things. He disguises I mean, these things quite poorly. It's quite embarrassing watching his apologetics around identity politics. He seems to have come up with a bank of excuses. I mean, I can't talk about all of his excuses because I only watched this debate, and I really don't like listening to him, because it's so much propaganda. It's so much fluff and dishonesty, essentially. But so one of his excuses was is that, when people bring up this principled point, or when they talk around this principled point, his first excuse is I can't think of any racism that white people receive from minority groups that is pertinent or relevant. So it's worth it to focus on this paradigm, because it's important to some people, and it is unimportant to white people. Um, so that's his sort of, I mean, that I think is a sort of a bit of a sidestepping excuse to sort of to involve yourself in a morally obtuse, fundamentally, sort of a dehumanizing paradigm. Um, that also makes it impossible for you to actually focus on actually solving real problems, because you can sort of support the narrative of people's, sort of resentment and their feelings of it is also a destruction of the moral language itself. That justice has been essentially stolen from the individual, stolen from a principled individual perspective, and it has been granted essentially mutually exclusively to the a kind of group essentialism, which gets inherited by the evil of the system, by the evil perpetrators. So sort of, well, it's not it's not the marginalized community's fault that they have these disgusting, sort of moral conflations and reductions around their group, because they weren't the ones who were perpetrated against. So you've got this really, strange world where you have this fundamental divide between people whose own moral computational, sort of mindset doesn't even belong to them. They're not even accountable for their own sort of moral sensibilities, because they were in some sense inflicted upon them according to the narrative. So you can just see how much it's programmed into the sociological plan, which is, sort of creating a hyperbolic exemplification of itself, so that it has to be treated. It has to be the center of the show. It has to be the ringleader, that there's no other way to solve the problem, but, sort of, it just needs to agitate the system and disrupt the system and make a large enough complaint that this is the only sociological plan that needs to go into treating the situation. And again, it's disgusting because it doesn't even fix the problem. It doesn't even focus on, let's say, the lack of education. It says that no, 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 the problem that we really have is the social psychology that has been impregnated with this historical injustice, this historical social injustice against these groups, becomes the central focus of everything, and so essentially it becomes a anyway, I've already sort of said it. And another way of exploring the issue that I was just talking about, is that how this mob mentality of a cultural program that has, the semantic claim and the sociological planning, what really is disgusting about it is that it really is antithetical to the notion of reason and leadership itself. It is corrosive to the very nature of pragmatic reality and planning. It is not capable of actually having a plan that does anything other than, in some sense, create a negative feedback loop to prove its own ideological claim. It's very strange in that way. But essentially, how it imposes on private nodes of administration or leadership, or, everything that makes a decision in the system, any kind of private entity that has any kind of prerogative over its own decision making, sort of the white male that has heteronormative sexual proclivities or interests or mentalities, that any node of decision making is ideologically taxed, that it has to be sort of called, it's part of the sociological planning, that those are the nodes that have to incubate the requisite development and education which supports the ideology sociological plan. That if the sociological plan is not seemingly successful, it's because we don't have enough of these private entities in the system that are showing the right leadership by being uh, supplicant to the sociological planning and the ideological narrative. So you don't have enough people that are donning the speech codes, the semantic, that are openly promoting the semantic claim, and aren't, in practice, somehow occluding their own prerogative to engage and participate in society. They instead need to participate in such a way so as to redistribute, the according to the sociological planning. So the thing is that the ideology itself, it has no point of criticism, because anything that would criticize it exacerbates its own claim, that it's not being served, um, and that it's being undermined by its perpetrator scapegoat. Its enemy is destroying it, by not following its tutelage. And so the weird thing is that, it has this whole bank of education. It has this whole narrative worldview, and it's not its job to proselytize it. It's somebody else's job to proselytize it. It's its enemy's job to proselytize it. So, you've kind of got a built-in paradox that is, you know, it's it's interesting that essentially leadership becomes completely inverted. Where essentially the most common sentiment, like the lowest common denominator intellectual feeling, is sort of needs to be pandered to by the most institutionally free sort of structural agent, or not just structural, but any agency that, or any self-determinism that is enjoyed within any sort of society or any culture. These nodes, these entities, these private individuals are ideologically taxed to supplement their leadership with the sentiments and the feelings of other people. Again, like this is a diversion from actually solving any kind of problem or condition, because it doesn't ever it's never able to get into the supply side of the cause of a problem. So instead of saying, well, the reason why we don't have an equal number in this field or something like that, which is, again, that's an expectation that one should never have, that people should just be this kind of generic mass, and so everything should be equally proportioned in every way. I mean, society historically has never been like that, even by groups that have the same relative cultural power, or the same, that's just not what humanity is like. Uh, and in some sense, trying to supplement for people's actual decision making. And anyway, um, if you think that there's a specific cultural problem as to why there aren't people in a field, then and see if you can do something about that culture. But and again, like, the idea is that within identity politics, it's never the local culture's fault. It's always the lack of cultural acceptance by the prevailing structure. That it's always the negative pressure being imposed by the private individuals, the private entities that are using their own prerogative freely or whatever. That it's the cultural of social psychology crafted by that strata that is creating a negative pressure as to why things aren't being aspired to, or why people don't have skills. Which is, a fundamentally dishonest reframing of reality. I mean, it's a way to project a problem onto culture rather than actually dealing with it in any kind of serious way. And so, the disgusting thing as well is that any kind of actual leadership or institution that is meant to actually provide, let's say, actual tools for people, or actual, sort of, who let's say are constitutionally tasked with the role of governance, they have a perfect way, essentially, to create policy and regulation, like in South Africa with Black economic empowerment and a particular form of affirmative action, which is so toxic and so irresponsible, where you just mandate outcomes, you mandate better statistics somehow, and somehow it's private entities that have to educate and develop people, that they just have to sort of do all these things. Somehow they have to overcome the disgusting and poor education system which is imposed by government. Somehow, government needs to be saved by its own lack of capacity, by private entities that have to come in and fill in the governmental role. And, it's a complete disorientation and inversion, that somehow the private sphere has to provide the role of government, and the role of government is essentially, to get the credit if the private sphere can actually carry that can, but to essentially generally enrich themselves, and to be unaccountable political elites, sort of ruling society as if they were actual participants within the market, having that kind of power uh, to abrogate resources towards themselves, and to do, sort of these shady, I mean, it's the same kind of economic structure that all fascist societies have, where you have this kind of heavy um, private, you keep things private, but there's public control over everything, rather than you actually setting up structures where the government actually is using tax to actually, either have a private public partnership that is meant to target a particular, you know um, policy purpose or aim or goal, in order to, develop skills, or provide, some kind of halfway house between leveling up, the infrastructure, or the, the market opportunity, or something like that. Because I mean, in some sense, what you would probably need the most investment in is in the supply side of skills. Better education, better skills development. That's basically the biggest role that government would have, is that you survey industry, you survey the economy, and you work out what's the best way to grow this thing, what skills are needed, and then you create a condition in which you can develop and retain those skills. Because the biggest thing is that the country is so badly managed that most people just leave the country, because they can see the writing on the wall, they can see sort of the looming, exponentially accelerating, sort of fascism, while all the projects and the policy that is, employed, is essentially in the form of this kind of destructive, disruptive imposition of forcing private entities to be the government for this failed, sort of psychologically penetrating projection. This is slightly close to the point that I spoke about at the end of one of my other recordings. It's a point that is part of a 3-hour recording. So let me just see if I can fish it out and recapitulate it, because it was a useful point. But it's strange that then essentially the quality of government becomes a kind of cultural infantilism, that the government takes on the role of a kind of moral paternal figure. And you can also see this very much in South Africa. It's the disgusting derogation and disintegration of a liberal democracy. Um, but that the government sort of becomes in charge of reproducing the culture. The people aren't individually free to develop the culture. Culture is a facet of the political project and the political class. Um, and you can see essentially how the whole political landscape has, because of the failure, because of the morally obtuse, unprincipled, sort of promulgation, and the normalization of fascistic values and fascistic politics. Um, you have Tito Mboweni and Cyril Ramaphosa, having all these identity politics sentiments, sort of issued all the time, and broadcast, uh, because without that moral narrative, also that there is no excuse for the lack of accountability in political leadership, the lack of, if you just look at government policy and its effects, that which the courts have even turned a blind eye to by inventing fake jurisprudence like the governmental prerogative, so that they don't actually have to say, well, this government policy is actually it fails the Constitution. It's a derogation of a constitutional duty and obligation that the state is not capable of delivering on its obligations. Therefore, I mean, in some sense, I think that I mean, apartheid was described and is a crime against humanity, but the ANC government, and also in the context of this political brave new epoch and this brave new world, which essentially, sort of is a kind of insanity, is a kind of delusion which is propped up by the conformity of the media in general, and the kind of this cultural wave that has even bent the courts into an institutional corruption of essentially not demarcating the lines of liberal values and principled, sort of justice for the individual, under the semantic weight of the misinterpretation of the Constitution and a misapplication of strange, philosophical, sort of rabbit hole thinking around um, social justice and critical race theory has come to fuse itself into um, a kind of a never-ending nexus of um, governmental a governmental prerogative, which is in some sense further emboldened to go deeper into inculcating democratic illiteracy. Right now, I think that both the political elites, but sadly, I mean, you can't say what political elites should or shouldn't do. They are, in some sense, they're put there by the electorate. But what is dangerous is that um, they are somewhat insulated by this culture, which is now being, overtly politically, I think even for some time was overtly politically engineered. That education was deliberately in rural communities and things like that. Education was downgraded on purpose in order to preserve and to exacerbate a kind of democratic illiteracy, to create a pool of low information voters that would buy the cheap narrative. Uh, because the more urbanized the population became, the less beholden they became to voting for the ruling party. But the point is that that the courts have essentially facilitated this unsustainable slide into illiberalism. I mean, it was. I saw that. Oh my word! It was. I thought it was quite pathetic. There was a professor who was interviewed on one of the national news shows, and she was headlined as being one of the authors of the Constitution, or part of the panel, or something like that. And completely well, I mean, not that there weren't panels and things like that, but anyway, um, I'll just say that this is not true. This is not how the Constitution was authored. But anyway, and she quotes. She tries to quote from Section 1 of the Constitution, and she says that this is a constitution based on social justice. Social justice is not mentioned in Section 1. What is mentioned in Section 1 is a liberal democracy, and also non-racialism is mentioned in Section 1. So it's interesting how liberal democracy has been completely occluded by, sort of the rhetoric of social justice. It's become sort of this addiction and this buzzword. And anyway, I mean, I'm talking too much, but and sort of fragmenting my points. But sorry, I should just get back to the point that I was making, that government has taken on a new function, essentially, which is essentially part of this cultural function to plug itself into this never-ending cycle of keeping the ideology and the ideological narrative, sort of operative and functional. It's a huge diversion on actual delivery, and it's a kind of infantilism, a cultural infantilism of people, which is premised in a kind of democratic illiteracy, where you know people are accountable to their government, not the government is accountable to the people. It's got that sort of disgusting inversion in it. And I guess I do just wish that people would go after the people, because you if you I think that's the only way to wake people up, is that you have to blame the people for the state of politics. You say, no, it's not the corrupt government, it's the corrupt people that have no principles, essentially. I mean, I think that's the only way that you get uh, anyway. And how people have allowed themselves to be addressed, by these kinds of political figures in these sort of what I would call fascistic tones. I mean, where the president has these family meetings and he talks about how certain things are in our DNA as South Africans. Um, with this kind of overtone that, well, if you don't go along with our solidarity fund, if you don't go along with our project to nationalize essentially pensions and things like that, if you don't go along with our prescribed assets, then essentially you are the enemy uh, within the society, which is already rhetoric which has come out of cabinet. Uh, anyway, yeah, I didn't recapitulate the point that well, but I also took some liberty when I first tried to make the point about the infantilization and the democratic illiteracy, near the near the end of that other recording that I first mentioned it. But in some sense, when I brought it up, I was making a much broader thematic claim about liberalism in general, and sort of the how people understand the state in a much more sort of illiberal way because of the lack of structure, which in some sense I think has to come from a judiciary. You have to have enough sort of substantive legal structure in a system in order to have the high standards of preserving a liberal democracy. But uh, anyway, I'm not going to relitigate those points because there was probably like a 25-minute rant on that point. But anyway,